Ukishile.
Molo Tolo.
Ngiyaphila.
Molo Mcenge.
Wema niyaphila mhlekazi.
Yes, siyaphila ndoda kuthi uphilile wena.
Ndiyacenga manje emakhaya ugqibele nini emakhaya?
Honorable Paulsen.
Ndiyagoduka ngomsuku bendibuya khona.
Hayi man, ngifuna nami ndiyovela emakhaya qadi ndilahlekelwe ngomnye umfana phaa eofisini kum unyekemba.
Okay.
Honorable Paulsen.
Ngcwatywe eCentane.
ECentane, okay.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Who's calling? It's Matex here, Honorable Paulsen.
How are you?
I'm good. Why are you only sending condolences to Mam Kaula? Am I not also a Zulu?
Hey.
Condolences to you too.
Thank you very
Dirk.
much. Thank you very much.
Hey, when
I first saw you,
Zulu,
you look like someone from what's this place where they have ostrich?
Zulu, man.
No,
you see,
you don't look like the usual.
Honorable Dex, there was a debate on television some years back, immediately after or during the time of the protest. There was a guy who was debating on behalf of the IFP. He was an Indian guy. And in the process, when the debate was heated, and Valimosa was there representing the ANC, this guy says, "We Indian Zulus."
Indian Zulu.
Yaguva Dex.
An Indian Zulu.
No, he was right, John. Good morning.
Yaguva Dex.
We are about to start. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. I welcome all members.
Yes, Gigi.
Babka, I welcome all members who have logged into the visual mini plenary session. As we bow our heads for an opportunity for silent prayer and meditation, let me also, on behalf of the presiding officers, acknowledge the passing on of His Majesty, King Goodwill Zwelithini Kabheka Zulu, King of the Zulu Nation. Shall we bow? Thank you very much. Honorable members, before we proceed, I would like to remind you that the visual mini plenary is deemed to be in the precinct of Parliament and constitute a meeting.
Is it my problem? We are not here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Members should equally note that anything said in the visual platform is deemed to have been said to the House. And may be ruled upon. All members who have logged in shall be considered to be present and are requested to mute their microphones and only unmute when recognized to speak. This is because the mics are very sensitive and will pick up noise which might disturb the attention of other members. And those members that are recognized to speak. Please unmute your microphone and connect your video. Members may make use of the icons on the bar of the bottom of their screens, which has an option that allows a member to put up his or her hand to raise points of order. The Secretariat will assist in alerting the chairperson to members requesting to speak. When using the visual system, members are urged to refrain or desist from unnecessary points of order or interjection. We shall now proceed to the order of this mini-plenary session, which is a subject for discussion in the name of the Honorable H. Denner on minimum wage increases, red tape and prescriptive labor legislation, how government is hampering unemployment creation and economic growth during a time of unprecedented unemployment and economic hardship in South Africa. I now recognize the Honorable Denner from the virtual platform. Honorable Denner.
Thank you, House Chair. Before I start, I would like to convey our most sincere condolences on the passing of King Goodwill Zwelithini this morning. May his soul rest in peace. House Chair, I quote the chairperson of the Labour Portfolio Committee when she said during our last meeting that we are here to improve the social conditions of our people. This is correct, we are. But it seems the ANC either do not understand the meaning of this or they don't know how to go about actually doing it. The fact of the matter is that the social conditions of our people are not improving. In fact, they are deteriorating by the day. And let me clarify, our people, honourable colleagues in the ANC, should be every single South African citizen. For the measure of a good government is the ability to govern to the benefit of all, not only a certain constituency, and certainly not only a few connected cadres. That being said, let's look at the social conditions of our people. The unemployment rate is nearly 33%. The expanded unemployment rate is nearly 43%. 23,000 skilled individuals leave South Africa annually. 25 million recipients of social grants. This is not an achievement. Load shedding, water shortages, the shocking state of local government, and money lost to fraud and corruption under the ANC government is estimated at about 1 trillion rand. That is money that could have gone a long way towards improving the social conditions of our people, and the list goes on. These are the facts, not fluff on how the government is improving the social conditions of our people, because the truth is that it cannot improve, and the unemployment rate will rise even further if government continues to hide behind a failed political ideology and implement legislation to that effect. Chairperson, restrictive labour legislation hampers job creation and economic growth. That is a fact. The FF Plus will never support any form of discrimination, and that is why we cannot support quota-based legislation in the workplace. Appointments should be made on merit, for if you appoint the best person for the job, someone with knowledge, experience, and good work ethic, the job will be done properly. This will lead to further job creation, thus improving the social conditions of our people. And please note that I said best person, not white person. Prescribing to businesses who they can appoint and how and who to do business with will never contribute to economic growth. Applying free market principles based on supply and demand, on the other hand, will. Case in point, the national minimum wage increases of 16% and 23% respectively in the agricultural and domestic sectors. Let me make this clear. I'm not saying that workers should be paid a starvation wage. In fact, if an employer can afford to pay more than the minimum wage, then you should do so. The main determination in wage negotiations should therefore be affordability. If government creates a conducive environment for the private sector where service delivery and economic growth can actually take place, businesses will be able to afford higher wages and employ more workers. Honourable Minister, 250,000 domestic workers lost their jobs during the lockdown. Most domestic employers are workers themselves. Many have lost their jobs or have taken pay cuts and will not be able to afford a 23% increase. Equally, very few businesses can afford to increase their salary bills by 16% all at once. Agricultural employers will be left with no choice but to reduce their labour force and mechanize where they can. Agbare voorsitter, die uitbuiting van werkers deur werkgewers is onaanvaarbaar. Maar waar 'n werkgewer werklik nie 'n voorgeskrewe loon kan bekostig nie, is enige loon waarvoor iemand bereid is om te werk beter as niks of 'n skamele maatskaplike toelaag. The Department of Labour has become notorious for unilaterally imposing prescriptive labour legislation and vilifying the very same employers who they expect to do what the department cannot, which is creating jobs and economic prosperity. The extension of the collective bargaining agreement for the restaurant and fast food industry earlier this year, without the buy-in of the majority of role players in this sector, perfectly illustrates the department's disregard for private sector employers. It seems the minister maybe did not get the memo or the meaning of making an informed decision through proper consultation, and I fear that only once this has led to further job losses, increased food prices, and even worse social conditions, the minister and ruling party will realize that they have won a Pyrrhic victory at too great a cost for themselves and ultimately our people. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member. The next speaker from the ANC, the Honourable A.F. Zuma.
Thanks, House Chairperson. South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. Many studies on inequality have shown that it is linked to many social ills. Inequality in our country manifests mainly through the skewed distribution of income. The most significant causes of income inequality in our country are based on the historically racialized and gender-based policies. Honorable Dina and her party would like us to believe that challenges of unemployment and poverty are due to the minimum wage increases, the so-called red tape and prescriptive labor legislation. The fact that these are discredited theories does not matter to them. I believe that it is important that the right-wing political parties in this parliament are reminded that they exist to defend their white and capitalist privilege they inherited from their forefathers. They did not sweat and bleed like some of us just to be able to speak freely in this house. A growing body of literature shows the devastating impact of inequality even for the wealthy. Professor Daniel Nettle, a behavioral scientist based at Newcastle University in England, asked an important question in his paper written in January 2021, why do inequality and deprivation produce high crime and low trust? Using a model based on the rational choice theory in economics, Nettle concluded that societies with high levels of inequality have more crime and lower levels of social trust. In another research by the World Bank, it was found that a simple measure of inequality predicts the rate of murder in different countries better than any other indicator. To put it simple language that even the honorable members of the Freedom Front Plus can understand, what research shows is that when the inequality gap in society is wide, the rate of murder and other crimes also go up. Perhaps next time we have a debate on crime in farming areas, we need to investigate the causal impact of inequality in those regions. We do not know, of course, that the right-wing parties are generally not bothered about things like evidence, like the phenomenon of triumphalism in the United States of America. The FF+, just like their twin sister, the DA, does not bother itself with things like facts and evidence. Facts are just inconvenient for far right-wing politicians. Right-wing politics historical has always been based on fake victimhood by the most privileged members of society. Fortunately, they will never govern South Africa again. As a caring and responsive governing party, the ANC must do everything in our power to reduce inequality in the interest of redressing legacy and colonialism apartheid. As the research that I have quoted shows, we must implement policies that reduce inequality, also in the interest of social stability, nation building and progress in our country. Wage in and inequality is deeply rooted in South Africa's history and plays a central role in overall income distribution and patterns of human development. The impact of income inequality and the workplace and social inequality are interlinked and cannot be separated. When the right-wing crackpots tells us that the minimum wage increases for domestic workers and farm workers cause unemployment, what they are arguing for is that the working poor, most of whom are Black African women, must remain in condition akin to slavery. When they talk about so-called red tape or prescriptive labor laws, what they mean is the representatives of the class of exploiters is that the working class deserve to live and work in conditions worse off than the animals of their farms. At least animals have SPCA to look after their rights. As the African National Congress, we say to you, no. What are you saying, Mrs. Dina? And is that this democratic parliament must agree to normalize the fact that 10% of high-income earners take home a whopping 65% of all our national income, while 90% of South Africans get only 35%. The regulations that protect the rights of the workers to collective bargaining, national minimum wage, occupational health and safety acts, among others, are means by which our government protects the human dignity of our people in the workplace. These are foundational principles in Chapter 2 of our Constitutional Bill of Rights. The far right-wing parties do not accept the basic principle that all persons are born equal. However, they have found a language to justify the insanity. Let us accept that there is nothing we can do to change the minds of hardened right-wingers. What we can do is to ensure that reasonable and progressive political parties in parliament act in consent for the form of bulwark against the ring-wing advances and attempts the watered down to hard-earned rights of workers, the poor women, and all the disadvantaged groups in South Africa. Oh, mama bethu babizwa amagama yingane zabo. Oh, baba bethu babizwa yingane zabo ngamagama. Bancama ukuthatha ukudla okukhona okuphilayo bakunikeza izilwane zabo kunokuthi banganikeza abazali bazo. Colonial and apartheid privilege must fall. Thank you, Chairperson.
The next speaker on the platform is the Honorable MJ Kado.
Thank you, Chairperson. Honorable Chairperson, before I start, I would also like to express my condolences on the part of the DA on the passing of King Goodwill Zwelithini. Chairperson, South Africa is in the grip of an unemployment epidemic. For years before the outbreak of COVID-19, we had been experiencing wave after wave of job losses thanks to the ANC's economic policy incoherence. The curve isn't getting any flatter. In fact, the number of unemployed people is accelerating faster and faster. Soon, our unemployment rate may peak at over 50%. According to the quarterly labour force survey for the fourth quarter of 2020, the official unemployment rate stands at 32.5%, the highest since the survey started in 2008. If you expand the definition of unemployment to include people who have given up looking for work, that figure soars to 42.6%. Between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the fourth quarter of 2020, 1.4 million people lost their jobs, and currently over 10 million South Africans can't find work. Our unemployment caseload threatens to overwhelm South Africa. If we carry on this path, our social infrastructure will collapse. Crime and unrest will spin out of control. The ANC will try to blame this calamity on the coronavirus pandemic, but the truth is that it has been years in the making. It is the legacy of ANC policies that deter investment and suffocate economic growth. It is a consequence of the ANC's ideological aversion to the private sector, and it is a function of our sclerotic labour market made rigid and inflexible by stringent laws and regulations. Instead of trying to improve the situation, the ANC seems determined to make it worse. For example, from the beginning of this month, the Minister of Employment and Labour hiked minimum wages for domestic workers and farm workers by 23% and 16% respectively. This is going to lead to a jobs bloodbath. Few sectors would be able to absorb such steep increases in ordinary times, yet the domestic service sector had already been hard hit by COVID-19, with many employers struggling to keep on their domestic workers. In the agricultural sector, a double-digit increase in the minimum wage will lead to increased mechanization, resulting in greater job losses. Now, the DA supports sustainable wage increases in the agricultural and domestic service sectors. But we do not believe that increases should be forced through by way of regulation. Increases should be determined by employers and workers entering into negotiations. Recent history has shown that one of the key factors fueling unemployment is the pace at which wage increases for unskilled workers has risen. So we are now likely to see more retrenchments and further job losses. In a country with unemployment as high as South Africa's, we should be pricing people into jobs, not out of them. Another industry that has been hammered by COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns, which ground business to a halt, is the restaurant industry. Yet in January, the Minister of Employment and Labour extended a collective agreement struck by the Bargaining Council for fast foods, restaurants, catering and allied trades to all employers and employees in that industry. This places all sorts of onerous obligations onto small business owners who weren't even party to the agreement in the first place. They will have to fork out above inflation wage increases, annual bonuses, stipends, and extortionate bargaining council levies they cannot afford. Truly, the extension of collective bargaining agreements to non-parties is one of the most pernicious practices enabled by our labour legislation. It suffocates small businesses, it destroys jobs, and that is why the DA is calling for it to be scrapped. Only the private sector can create jobs at scale and rapidly absorb predominantly unskilled workers into the economy. For that to happen, we need to free up the private sector from the dead hand of overregulation by the state. Overregulation and inflexible labour laws, as well as collective bargaining rules that empower politically connected unions over individual workers and employers, lock millions of citizens out of jobs. That is what fuels inequality, Honourable Zuma, with all your ranting and raving about so-called right-wing parties. It's amazing that you can come here and hold forth with such misplaced confidence when your own so-called progressive party has created one of the worst unemployment crises in the world. You wouldn't know progress if it landed on your head. So here are a few recommendations for you. Let's take on the vested interests in big business and the big unions. Let's initiate a program of labour market deregulation. Let's exempt small and newly established firms from the extension of collective bargaining agreements, and let's empower individual economic sectors to set their own minimum wages and offer tax exemptions to small businesses to help them absorb the cost of minimum wages. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Honourable Karo. The next speaker is the Honourable C.N. Mukonto from the EFF.
Thank you, Chairperson. Let me take this opportunity and also pass our condolences to the Zulu nation as they have lost their king. Chairperson, we must condemn this right-wing, anti-black and anti-workers driven nonsense that seeks to suggest that we have to choose between the dignity and livelihood of workers and economic growth. The suggestion that you cannot grow the economy and pay workers decent wages above the working poverty line is based on a long-held belief that Black workers in this country are a source of cheap disposal labor. The suggestion is based on a belief that workers, and particularly Black workers, are easily disposable and exist only to serve whiteness and elites in restaurants, clean offices, drive buses, and grow food in the farms, but cannot have their own homes, cannot afford transport, and cannot feed their families. That simply means, Chair, that farm workers cannot afford to buy the food that they are producing on daily basis. If we are all honest, subjects like this are driven by racism and hatred of workers. It is the racist and abusive political economy that subjected more than 50% of all workers to wages below the working poverty line, when more than half the population lives in poverty. The reality is that majority of workers continue to earn poor wages, even with the current national minimum wage. The national minimum wage in its current form is just in paper, and it ends there. Most employers are aware that the government has no capacity nor interest to enforce the implementation of the national minimum wage. The Department of Employment and Labor has a total of 600 plus minus 600 labor inspectors to inspect workplaces in the whole country. As the EFF, working through our labor desk, launched to assist workers with some of these challenges that unions are failing to address and need immediate intervention, we have witnessed how companies are failing to implement the national minimum wage. Some of these companies are those doing business with the state. Let us demonstrate that this idea that you cannot pay.
Sorry, Ma'am Konto.
This is problem. Is it
Honorable Siweya, please mute your mic. You can go ahead, Honorable Member.
Some of these companies, Chair, are those doing business with the state. Now, let us demonstrate that this idea that you cannot pay workers poor wage, you can pay workers poor wage and at the same time grow the economy is one of the biggest confusion. First of all, South Africa's economy is not growing because there are no industries that produce industrial and household goods consumed daily. In other ways, there is no strategy or industrial policy aimed to grow the economy. It is the failed state, corruption, and incompetent ruling party entrusted with government that is hampering job creation and economic growth. Secondly, for any economy to grow, workers must be consumers of the goods and services they produce and offer. To be able to do that, workers must have disposable income. We don't live under the apartheid anymore, where workers are paid low wages and are expected to return to some corner in some Bantustan to die. Workers should be consumers, and when they spend in large numbers on what they produce, the economy will definitely grow. But let us remind honorable members that the EFF is the only organization that has in its founding manifesto a cardinal pillar to create millions of sustainable jobs, including introduction of the minimum wage to close the gap between the rich and the poor. That is to close apartheid wage gap. The need to increase the national minimum wage must be understood within the context of more than 100 years of institutionalized slave wage that continues to condemn Black workers and their families to abject poverty. You cannot solve systematic challenges of failed state, corrupt ruling party, capitalist greed, and racism by continuing to exploit workers. It is not possible, Chair. If you want capitalists to be honest about their profit margins, let workers down their tools and engage in a strike. You will hear about billions lost by the affected companies in all media houses. Chairperson, the national minimum wage, the increase of the national minimum wage is being supported. Ngiyabonga Sihlalo.
Sibonga, Honorable Member Mkonto. Soneshwa Ngobo from the IFP.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. The IFP wishes to pass condolences to the members of the family, royal family, and the whole nation for the passing on of our king. When we were beginning to have hope that he was holding on well, we also wish the traditional Prime Minister of the Zulu Nation, umntwana wakwaphinda angene ukuba aqine yimani njalo nina besilo lizodlula lelifu. The IFP notes that at present, according to the most recent figures, there are at least 7.1 million unemployed people in the country. If we consider the extended definition of unemployment, then that figure goes up to 10.8 million. These figures have no doubt have been compounded by the pandemic and have left millions of households uncertain about their futures. The IFP recognizes the efforts on the part of government and the relevant departments in attempting to alleviate the hopelessness of unemployment during the unprecedented crisis. Further, the Household Affordability Index has shown that basic food items for South African households cost 2,194 rand and 2 cents. The pandemic and these over variables demand a responsive government that allows even the most vulnerable to live with security and dignity. The national minimum wage has increased by 4.5% to 21 rand and 69 cents, a development that the IFP welcomes and will continue to support. The national minimum wage, in light of the pandemic and food price hikes, is still not a livable wage for many households. It remains far below the daily expenses of so many families, and yet they must make do while still showing up to work or job-seeking activities with enthusiasm. The IFP is not only oblivious to the challenges of economic climate we are currently facing. We recognize that industries across the board are struggling. However, a balance is needed. One where we can pay the most vulnerable of our people a truly livable wage that affords them a future and dignity while still contributing sustainably to the growth of our economy. A balance that recognizes that hard times can be conquered, supported by the industries that are playing their part in the fight against unemployment. The workers who stand to benefit from this increase remain are unable to save and bear the brunt of job losses during all the times of crisis. The IFP supports the increase in the national minimum wage. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member Ngobo. From the FF Plus, the Honorable Tibriet.
Dankie voorsitter en ook net weer eens ons innige simpatie vir die afsterwe van Thokozile Malinga. Voorsitter, die minister van Arbeid se ondeurdagte buitensporige verhoging van die minimumloon, veral met betrekking tot plaaswerkers, gaan nie tot werkskepping of die verlaging van werkloosheid lei nie. Dit gaan juis die teenoorgestelde tot gevolg hê. Wat die minister en die ANC-regering nie verstaan nie, is dat die vraag nie is of landbouers die verhoging in minimumloon wil betaal nie, maar of hulle dit kan betaal. Ja, landbou is die enigste sektor in die ekonomie wat tydens die pandemie gegroei het, maar dis relatief voor die hand liggend oor hoekom dit so is en nie werklike maatstaf vir die bekostigbaarheid van 'n buitensporige minimumloonverhoging in die landbousektor nie. Honorable Zuma, speaking of the top earners in South Africa, please listen carefully to what I'm about to say next. What you and your ANC government do not realize is that nearly half of the total number of farmers in South Africa have an annual turnover of less than 1 million rand. Note that I said turnover and not profit. Ministers, on the other hand, have an annual income of more than twice that. Let that sink in for a minute and then further take into account that ministers do not have a staff complement of about 30 farm workers they have to sustain and now pay an additional 16% increase in salaries out of that 2 million rand. But the peak picture keeps getting more gloomy the longer we interrogate this insane increase. When ranking food security worldwide, South Africa is 69th of 113 countries, thus at the bottom half of food secure countries in the world. Yet, we continue to bury our producers under even more unreasonable legislation. This ranking is not good and will become even worse if we do not start protecting our agriculture sector. If government is going to continue to increase minimum wage above reasonable proportions, if they continue to set demands that our agriculture sector cannot viably reach, our farmers will have no other choice but to do away with labor altogether. They will be forced to mechanize, and if they can't afford it, they will simply stop farming, especially our smaller farmers that have an annual turnover of less than 300,000 Rand. This, Chairperson, is the turnover of the majority of the half of the farmers we spoke of earlier who earn less than 1 million Rand per annum. But let me give you an example of where this occurred. I especially want the ANC to listen up because it is one of your compatriots. It is one of your beloved BRICS countries. It is a country also currently dumping their excesses, i.e. chicken, on South Africa because the legislation that should be focused on and should be improved to protect our agriculture sector is not being improved and does not protect our farmers. And yes, I am talking of Brazil. Brazil has replaced its workers and mechanized farms. They now have bigger farms, bigger produce, bigger profit and less workers. Maar voorsitter, ek sluit af en die agbare Zuma moet weer haar oortjies vir my spits. Dit is nodig om die propagandastellings van haar en sekere politici aan te spreek. Stellings wat sê dat Suid-Afrikaanse landbouers so ryk is en daarom maklik die salaris toevoegings kan bekostig, is bloot onwaar en misleidend. Dit doen ook onnodig afbreek aan 'n sektor sonder wie Suid-Afrika maar sy deure kan sluit. Voorsitter, met die stygende pryse van elektrisiteit, water en brandstof kan hierdie landbouers nie 'n skielike verhoging in arbeidskoste bekostig nie. Hulle keuse gaan bankrotskap of die vernietiging en die vermindering van werkers wees. Voorsitter, 'n volk wat vir sy landbou sorg, sorg vir sy toekoms. Ek dank u.
Thank you, Honorable Member Briet. From the ACDP, Honorable Thring.
Thank you, Honorable House Chair. The ACDP firstly offers its condolences to the royal household on the passing of His Majesty King Goodwill Zwelithini. It must be noted that President Cyril Ramaphosa at his last SONA maintained that the country would not achieve higher growth rates and employment without the implementation of structural economic reforms. Structural reforms tackle obstacles to the fundamental drivers of growth, liberalizing labor, product, and service markets, and thereby encouraging job creation, investment, and improving productivity. Structural reforms boost an economy's competitiveness, growth potential, and adjustment capacity, as well as the human and institutional capabilities of a country. The ACDP acknowledges the need to address the imbalances of the past across all sectors. However, it is clear that government's attempts have failed as a result of an inability by the ruling party to implement the structural reforms needed, largely due to policies such as BBEE and expropriation of land without compensation, and other labor legislation that work against employment creation. The proof of the pudding, they say, is in the eating. Our Gini coefficient sits at some 0.62, making us one of the most unequal nations in the world. Our unemployment rate is at 32.5% and 42.6% on the expanded definition. We have a small tax base of just 5 million individuals, already overburdened and continues to shrink. Our annualized GDP contracted by 7% despite a positive rebound in the fourth quarter of last year. Our debt to GDP in 2019-20 reached 62.2%, 81.8% in the 2020-21 year, growing to some 88% in the outer years, while our budget deficit for 2020-21 is 14% of GDP. The ACDP's solution to our economic malaise is to stick to a strict fiscal consolidation path to avoid a sovereign debt crisis, thereby restoring fiscal credibility for the rating agencies and investors, and avoid the incessant bailouts to bankrupt and corrupt SOEs. We must arrest the current debt spiral by removing obstacles to growth, drivers to growth, free up our labor, product, and service markets, thereby encouraging job creation, foreign and domestic investment, and improving productivity. We must boost our economy's competitiveness, growth potential, and adjustment capacity, and improve the efficiency of expenditures and strengthen revenue mobilization. Corruption must be dealt a death blow by capacitating all of our crime-fighting units, as corruption affects the poorest of the poor. These are the solutions and structural reforms needed to increase employment and grow our economy as presented by the ACDP. I thank you, House Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We seem not to having a member from the UDM, ATM. I call upon Honourable Ntombela from the African National Congress. Baba Ntombela.
Thank you, House Chair. Greetings to honourable members, and let's also, Honourable Chair, extend our heartfelt condolences to the Zulu royal family, Ngokotama Kwengonya, and also to the family of Thokozile Malinga, who fell a day before yesterday. May their souls rest in peace. House Chairperson, today's debate focuses on a very important aspect of everyday life of our people, the South African economy and its labor market policies. At the core of the debate is whether our labor policies are an impediment to the fight against growing unemployment. Perhaps I should begin by stating that this debate is sponsored by the Freedom Front Plus and is supported by their sleeping partners, that is the Democratic Alliance, and all those who have since joined. And let me hasten to acknowledge that we are not surprised at all as the ANC that 27 years into our democracy, the Freedom Front Plus still believes that our people must be exploited and pushed further away from the mainstream economy. Their friends in the DA support this reactionary sentiment, as in fact demonstrated in their submissions, which is full of arrogance and indignation towards the fate of our people, particularly the farm workers. The FF plus hatred for this country, the majority of whom are Black, is so intense, House Chairperson, that they can no longer hide it. Their racism overwhelms them to the extent of using our parliament to declare their undying love for big business, which exploits our people on a daily basis. In an attempt to persuade South Africans that their reactionary position on the minimum wage is not driven by racism, their speakers here looked and sounded rather too ridiculous to make any sense, as demonstrated by the arrogance that they have made. House Chairperson, the ANC seminal document, the Freedom Charter, which was adopted 66 years ago, provided strategic guidance on this matter when it declared there shall be work and security, close quote. The Freedom Charter further insists that there shall be a 40-hour working week, a national minimum wage, paid annual leave and sick leave for all workers, and maternity leave on full pay for all working mothers, close quote. As a consequence, the South African labor market has experienced numerous shifts since the dawn of democracy, guided by this overarching principle. The historical commitment and principle incidentally responds to some of the fallacies put forward by this nonsensical motion of the Freedom Fund Plus and their friends. The South African labor market is a product of years of racial and gender exploitation, a denial of labor rights and exclusion for workers who toil in the mines, farms, transport, hospitality services, public sector, and many more, including domestic workers. As a result of these historical injustices, the democratic government has inherited the tragedy of poor working conditions, slave wages, and low skill formation that is overly characterized by race and gender classification. House Chairperson, as guided by the Freedom Charter, the ANC-led government has introduced the national minimum wage with effect from the 1st of January 2019 which applies differentially across sectors. These will now be equalized into a single national minimum wage from the 1st of March 2021. For us as the ANC, this is an important step in the struggle to improve working conditions of our people in the most vulnerable sectors and to address the historical injustices. The Freedom Charter further asserted, House Chair, that mine workers, domestic workers, farm workers, and civil servants shall have the same rights as all others who work, close quote. The impending standardization of these conditions of employment must be understood within the context of a fulfillment of the commitments by South African people who gathered in Kliptown and whose collective wisdom birthed the Freedom Charter. As a member of the International Labour Organization, South Africa proudly supports the Decent Work Agenda, which was developed in 1999. This program is organized around 4 strategic pillars, which are the social protection, social dialogue, and social protection, rights at the workplace, and employment creation. Decent work is located at the center of efforts to reduce poverty and as a means for achieving equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. It involves opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income. This is done in order to stabilize the economy and to ensure that all workers in this country are able to afford basic living necessities. This national minimum wage, which we are implementing, must be understood in this context. The National Development Plan and Elections Manifesto of 2014 also accentuated our commitment to the national minimum wage. We agreed then that we needed a few years to finalize the modalities of the minimum wage as an instrument to reduce inequality and end poverty amongst our people. This position was further reaffirmed by the resolutions of the 54th National Conference, which resolved that the national minimum wage must be implemented as a matter of urgency, as the new minimum wage regime will impact positively on the lives of many low-paid workers, close quote. In our view, House Chairperson, that minimum wage must be allowed to increase until the challenge of poverty is addressed, which will inevitably drive economic expansion. This is a great achievement for the workers of this country whose hard work and sweat are the bedrock upon which this economy is built. Our economy has over the period taken a huge bettering from global economic conditions compounded by particular local challenges exacerbated by structural challenges of the apartheid economy. It is not surprising, therefore, Chair, that South Africa would be considered as one of the most unequal society in the world. As it stands, our country suffers from very high levels of poverty, racism, inequality, and growing unemployment that currently stands over 30% in terms of narrow definition. House Chairperson, the Freedom Front Plus position is a very old and stale neoliberal argument that supports the notion of a labor market flexibility, which is in reality is about the entrenchment of the basic tenets of the neoliberal agenda of reducing the role of the state to that of a passive regulator in favor of markets to cut costs at the expense of workers and in order to maximize profits. What they are proposing is a reduction of labor rights and benefits of workers, which will inevitably result in the creation of a working poor labor segment. The International Labour Organization is not convinced, Chair, that South Africa has a rigid labor market that circumvent youth employment and employment in general. The ILO attributes unemployment to fragile economic conditions, skills mismatches, and education challenges, which we still need to resolve. We must appreciate the swift response. Thanks, Honorable Chair. We support the new national minimum wage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. From the NFP, the Honorable Sibisi.
Honorable House Chair, in a developmental state like South Africa, minimum wage is vitally important to protect the workers from the greedy and unscrupulous employers whose sole purpose is to maximize on their bottom line, even at the expense of people. The Minister of Labour, Tolashe, published the new minimum wage in the Gazette, which currently sits at 21 rand 69 cents per ordinary hour. It is all well and fair, but is there any monitoring done by the Department of Labour to ensure that the minimum wage is adhered to? We are inclined to believe that the answer is a resounding no, because most of these departments always complain about the lack of capacity when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. In the Gazette, the minister went on further to promulgate that farm workers are entitled to a minimum wage of 21 rand 69 per hour. Domestic workers are entitled to a minimum wage of 19 rand 9 cents per hour. Workers employed on an expanded public works program are entitled to a minimum wage of 11 rand 93 cents per hour. If we look back to the first implementation of minimum wage in South Africa, this was set at 20 rand per hour in 1 January 2019. It then increased to 20 rand 79 cents per hour the following year, to now at 21 rand 69 cents per hour. In the space of less than 3 years, the minimum wage since its implementation has increased by 1 rand 69 cents. This needs to be measured against inflation, the rent value and the standard of living in the country since. It is impractical. The cost of living continues to spiral in this country. Government must keep aloof from implementing policies that do not speak to the current circumstances of the country. We talk about widening inequality gap in South Africa, yet the policies that are being implemented do not remotely speak to these challenges. We all know that employers are not too happy about the increase in the minimum wage. Thus, this may have an inverse effect. Employers are notoriously known for reducing labor costs when costs of production inputs costs go up. The National Freedom Party would like to know whether the implementation of the minimum wage, particularly the increases, comes with the protection of the labor force, one way or the other, or some form of incentives for small businesses in particular. Red tape alone is a burden to small businesses because creating an enabling environment for business is fundamental to creating a competitive economy. It has been reported that the research shows that the red tape costs South Africans 79 billion per year. This is equivalent to 6.5 of GDP or 16.5 of the total wage paid in 2003. Within the same token, government regulation is vital, but it should not come at the cost of the economy. The National Freedom Party believes that the government must do more to protect workers, especially during these trying times.
Busy. We are
must be wary of the inverse.
Honorable Sibisi, Siyabonga. We do not have a member from the AIC. We don't have a member from the PAC. From Al-Jama, Honorable MGE Hendricks. The next speaker. Honorable Hendricks, are you there? Honorable Hendricks seems not to be there. We will proceed to DA. The Honorable C. Kruger.
Thank you, Chairperson. Also, please note my condolences to the Zulu Nation. The Ramaphosa administration and ANC bureaucrats are failing entrepreneurs because little time, thoughts, and effort are spending reducing red tape. Administrative barriers and regulatory compliance costs are hand in hand with the term red tape and a crucial topic in the South African discourse on economic reform. Government is limiting entrepreneurial opportunities through burdensome legislation and regulation. They're suffocating economic growth in the process. According to the World Bank, SMEs contribute 20% to our GDP, and their contribution to the total employment in South Africa was almost 50% before the pandemic. Small businesses are critical drivers of economic growth, innovation, and job creation. But that requires government policies that concentrate on enhancing entrepreneurial activities, which is simply not the case in South Africa. Red tape is a massive obstacle to SMMEs. While the number of SMMEs has declined, the regulatory burden on them has increased. The South African government concern on red tape started in the early 2000s and was echoed by every president in their sonas. House Chair, just talk, no action. In the 70s, Herbert Kaufman compares the phenomenon of red tape in the same space with death and taxes as a certainty of life, which is definitely true in South Africa. In a survey by the SBI, they conclude that over half of SMME owners, 53%, believe that government regulations are restrictive to small business future growth. When studying the success of other countries that turn unemployment around, one of the best practices that address unemployment is to create a friendly business environment where red tape is the last concern for entrepreneurs. Red tape frustrates entrepreneurs from getting things done, it costs money, and it wastes time. Government, however, spend billions of rands on small business development, and it's good so, and only a few rands on reducing red tape, hence the high failure rate of small businesses. People's dignity is often one of the casualties, and the community instability one of the consequences. The government must use their powers and functions to free small business from the clutches of red tape. The Small Business Institute chairperson, Bernard Swanepoel, recently said in a news article that the government was flying in the dark when it came to red tape challenges. The NDP document on page 143 is clear that government must reduce administrative costs and other bureaucratic burdens for startups and existing business. Simplify the regulatory environment, which include regulations about business registration, tax, labor, and local government. Chairperson, the Ramaphosa administration failed not only our economy, but also the NDP in this regard. Of course, the ANC will rather blame COVID-19 for the absolute alarming statistics around SMMEs, but it's only political blind that will believe them. The Ease of Doing Business Private Members Bill tabled by the DA will help government identify, measure the impact thereof, and rectify regulatory burdens and government failures in small business environment. President Ramaphosa has asked the nation to work together to kickstart the economy. The Ease of Doing Business Bill is the DA's commitment to do this for the sake of all South Africans. We urge the President to convince his cabinet to support this program, pro-jobs and anti-poor initiative. Chairperson, the ANC government must smell the coffee. Red tape is a real threat for job creation. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. And the next speaker is the Honorable the Minister of Employment and Labor from the ANC. Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Honorable Chairperson and Honorable Members. Njengoba izithethe ezininzi sezitshilo phambi kwam, isizwe sikhathazekile, sidakumbile ngokuwa kwenkonyama isilo, sigqithisa uvelwano. Speaker or Chairperson and Honorable Members, the motion from the FF Plus is welcome. It does not present a problem to us. It rather provides us with an opportunity to educate them and reinforce our position and our resolve on the national minimum wage rates set from the 1st of March 2021. Indeed, these issues have already been fully ventilated in the portfolio committee. The national minimum wage has been increased from 20 Rand 76 cents to 21 Rand 69 cents per hour from the 1st of March. Depending on hours worked, this is equivalent to 867.60 cents per week, or 3,470 Rand 40 cents per week. I'm sure we can agree that these are not outrageous figures and provide for bare minimum to meet the essential needs. The increase is based on a 3% inflation rate plus an additional 1.5% in order to maintain the value of the national minimum wage in terms of purchasing power. Following a transitional phase, the national minimum wage of 21 Rand 69 cents per hour as of the 1st of March will now apply to farm workers. This decision was supported by the evidence that the agricultural sector was not so severely affected by the COVID lockdown, as the food value chain remained open since it constituted an essential service at the time of the lockdown. In absolute numbers, and I want to emphasize this, in absolute numbers, the increase for the farming sector translates to a mere 3 rands per hour. The minimum wage for domestic workers is increased to 88% of the national minimum wage, which translates to 19 rands 9 cents per hour as of March the 1st of March 2021. This sector, judging by the findings of the quarterly labor force survey, was severely impacted by the lockdown, and the lower increase is designed to prevent further disruption and job losses. The minimum wage for domestics is expected to be aligned with the national minimum wage when the next review is considered for 2022. The National Minimum Wage Act includes provision for employers that are genuinely unable to pay the proposed adjustment to apply for exemption. Recognizing that the COVID-19 has impacted on the employers, they are invited to utilize the exemption process. Early consultation with the labor and the provision of the required documentation will expedite the process. But they must be ready as they apply, not collectively, as individual employers, that they will have to open their books. Their books have to be scrutinized. They must be ready for that process before any conclusion can be taken. Let me make a very important point on legislation. The process of making any law in this democratic South Africa is not a careless, it's not a reckless process, Honorable Dana. It is a meticulous, cautious, careful, patient, and well-considered process. When we make laws, honorable members, before us is the constitution of the country. Before us is the economy of the country. Before us are the people of this country with all their needs and their aspirations. Honorable Dana and all other honorable members who are opposed to the minimum wage, when government makes the law, we add a big dose of foresight. This is what we did when we were formulating the national minimum wage and processed it till it became an act. We may not have known about the looming disaster of COVID-19 that has engulfed the entire world currently, but we formulate laws, we make them to be waterproof, to withstand even the heaviest storms. This is what we did with the national minimum wage. We are confident that not only the COVID-19 heavy disaster will fail to crush it, but other future calamities, catastrophes, cataclysms, we will fail to rattle the good work we are doing with the National Minimum Wage Act. Salo, simile, sithe ngomololo, kulo mcimbi wemivuzo yabasebenzi ethe xaxa. Asijiki kwaye sibheka phambili. It is common cause that South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And this is reflected in the labor market. and wide disparities in income. The roots of this lie in the centuries-long history of exploitation through slavery, forced labor, and the apartheid cheap labor system based on the migrant labor and cohesion. Some of you who are beneficiaries of these criminal, cruel laws. As a country, we still battle with this legacy. The National Minimum Wage Act is a small step towards beginning to address the legacy. The National Minimum Wage Act came into force from January 2019, setting a historic precedent for protection of the low-earning and vulnerable workers and providing a platform for reducing inequality in the national labor market. It is illegal and unfair labor practice for the employer to unilaterally alter hours of work or other conditions of employment in implementing the national minimum wage. The national minimum wage is an amount payable for ordinary hours of work and does not include payment of allowances such as transport, tools, food, accommodation, payments in kind like boarding and lodging, tips, bonuses, and gifts. So the Act requires the National Minimum Wage Commission to review the rates annually, Honorable Dana, and to make recommendations to the minister, taking into consideration the cost of living, gross domestic product, the wage levels, the collective bargaining outcomes, productivity, ability of employers to carry on their businesses successfully, the operation of the small, medium, and micro enterprises and the new enterprises, and the likely impact of the recommended adjustment on employment. And I need to flag this, that in relation to all policy development and legislation, government conducts a social, political, and economic assessment of the likely impact. It would be irresponsible to do otherwise. International, it is worth noting that there is nothing new about national minimum wage. Indeed, 90% of the ILO states have a national minimum wage. The first to do so was New Zealand in 1894. India did so in 1948 after independence. It's widely recognized that the minimum wage the minimum wages are the one of the measures that can be used to tackle income inequality. But of course, progress comes with conflict and struggle. We see this today in the United States, where the party of Trump seeks to keep the minimum wage low to maintain the profits of the employers, whilst the party with links to the organized labor seeks to increase the minimum wage to provide a decent wage. And there's nothing, the argument here raised by DA and FF+, it's about the profits for those who are exploiting the workers. And of course, those who oppose the minimum wage or any increase in the rate for minimum wage, they always justify their stance on the grounds that such a wage would inevitably lead to mass unemployment. South Africa is no different. Entrenched privileges are again up in arms at the prospect of having to pay reasonable minimum wage to workers under cover of maintaining employment. In all honesty, a mere increase of 3 rands will not break anyone's bank account. Their argument is that any wage is better than no wage at all. This is a recipe for a race to the bottom and the entrenchment of poverty and inequality and the apartheid cheap labor system, as they are continuing with it. And some have resorted to taking the desperate foreign nationals, knowing that they will take anything. We have a moral and a constitutional obligation to oppose this. It makes economic sense. Starvation wages means that just that. There is no discretionary income left to make additional purchases and therefore holds back the aggregate demand and the economic stimulus that comes with a fairer income distribution. So has the minimum wage led to widespread retrenchment? I'm asking that question, and you must ask that question and do proper research. In fact, initial research by the National Minimum Wage Commission, drawing on the research capacity of the University of Cape Town, the University of Johannesburg, has found that national minimum wage was broadly complied with by many employers and did not place an undue burden on them or lead to job losses in the first year of implementation. The ILO research indicates similar findings internationally. Our very own inspection reports confirm these findings. These reports show that the level of compliance with the national minimum wage is at 95% of those employers inspected. So the opposition and some employers will now tell us that with the adverse effects of the pandemic and the lockdown restrictions, they cannot afford to pay the national minimum wage. And to do so would only lead to retrenchment and unemployment. They seek to use the current crisis to justify low wages. Paradoxically, when the same employers were lobbying government to avail and extend COVID-19 benefit payments, they never objected to the decision to use the national minimum wage as a minimum floor for payments. Government is not unresponsive to legitimate claims, where they are accompanied by compelling evidence that the individual employer is unable to pay. It was with this in mind that from the start, the National Minimum Wage Act included provision for exemptions. And indeed, this process is already underway in relation to the new national minimum wage rate. So far, the Commission has received 10 exemptions applications. 8 of these have been granted, with the remaining 2 currently subject to audit. Government is committed to balancing the legitimate needs of the workers with supporting employers and employment. But what we cannot do is allow the wholesale national or sectoral exemptions in a what we would call a one-size-fits-all approach that drives a wedge through government efforts to promote greater equity in the labor market and to reduce low wages and poverty amongst the working people. Masikhusele amalungelo abasebenzi. Silungise izigwegwe zocalucalulo labantu bethu. Esivela kulo ngenxa ye-apartheid. Abanye bengokolo calucalulo basafuna ukulukhusela. Thanks, Honorable Nobo, for the IFP, for educating EFF Plus. The difference between the minimum wage and the living wage. They seem not to understand what we are talking about. Honorable Dana, Honorable Zuma, you are right. FF Plus and DA are allergic to facts. When laws are formulated in this country, there are many platforms of consultation. Honorable Dana, do you not know which country you are living in? Because in this one, our laws do not go to social partners. I mean, they do go to social partners for deliberations. And business is represented. There are waves and waves of public hearings that the formulation of laws is subject to. I beg you, Honorable Den, the public gets given an opportunity to bring all their views forth. No laws in this country are unilaterally imposed by the ANC. FF Plus must not be enemies of facts. And Honorable Kadu, we just cannot list social ills in this country and be opposed to the national minimum wage and its adjustment. Your speech was riddled with so many contradictions, a reflection, a party that is totally confused and directionless. At one stage, you support Thank you, Chief.
We now move to the FF Plus, the Honorable Dana.
Thank you, Chairperson. And thank you, Minister, for that explanation. I will handle that during my speech now. Honorable Zuma and Honorable Nonsele makes this about race. How short-sighted. Black employers and black farmers are also suffering, while your cadres, such as the ANC's SG Ysmagashule, lives in luxury, while the working poor, the majority of which, the EFF is correct, are black women, live in squalor and are subjected to unimaginable social conditions while waiting for you, the ANC, to make good on the promises that you have been making for nearly 30 years. Let me, in the Minister's words, add a good dose of foresight and warn the Honourable Zuma, your justification of brutal farm murders will have you and your party end up with blood on your hands. And remember, without employers, there will be no employees. Jobs do not fall from the sky, and neither did the food you had for breakfast this morning. Minister, you mentioned the national minimum wage research done by the University of Johannesburg, commissioned by the National Minimum Wage Commission, to counter arguments that the excessive increases of 16 and 23% of the minimum wage will lead to further job losses in these sectors. This research is based on the responses of 47 respondents in the agricultural sector and 53 respondents in the domestic sector in total. In total, Minister, in the entire country. In contrast to that, let me enlighten the members on the efforts made by employers to prevent job losses. The Minister and the Portfolio Committee have ignored letters and requests from a prominent agricultural organization with more than 6,000, not 47, 6,000 members, desperately trying to communicate and convey the situation on the ground. And that is that there are many farms and farmers who cannot afford a 16% increase all at once in their salary bills. Other organizations with an excess of 30,000 members have made representations to the department, Honourable Minister. I know about the consultation with the social partners about the effect of excessive wage increases. This was not taken into account. They also want to prevent job losses. They also care for their workers and their families. And contrary to what has been spewed here today, but are repeatedly vilified and ignored, just like the minority comments, the comments that the Minister mentioned from those business representatives on the National Minimum Wage Commission. Also people on the ground who know what the reality and the economic and social conditions out there are, and not in a government office aggressively forcing ideology-based legislation down the throats of those who, unlike the government, actually contribute to the economy. During the State of the Nation address, President Ramaphosa emphasized the importance of a good relationship between the private and public sectors, specifically to promote job creation and curb unemployment. Why is it then that the Minister of Labour and unfortunately key role players in the Portfolio Committee, as we have seen here today, insists on vilifying and antagonizing private sector employers at every single opportunity they get to do so? You are being handed the solution to unemployment and economic hardship. Support the private sector by freeing up their hands and grow the economy and create jobs so that inequality can be addressed, and stop hiding behind race rhetoric as an excuse for your failures. I thank you.
Honorable Member, please take care of your time. It will cause a lot of commotion unnecessarily. However, thank you very much for that. Honorable members, an important announcement is that concludes the debate and the business of this virtual mini-plenary session. The mini-plenary will now rise. Thank you very much.
You do not analyze your opposition, comrades.